Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. What does it mean to be free? This past weekend, I attended a conference on the Atlantic coast of Florida, where a friend of mine has seen right whales breaching on the horizon. At this event, one of the speakers used an entertaining analogy. Imagine we took one of those whales and decided to release it from the constraints of the ocean. What if we dragged its massive body up on the beach, stepped back and declared, "You're free of the ocean. Walk, run, jump." Would that whale be pleased with us or feel freed? Well, surely not, because a whale finds true freedom in a crucial limit, staying in the ocean. It belongs in a certain environment, and the beach ain't it. We easily understand this. But how many of us attempt to leave the limits of our human design, to work harder and faster, to say yes to more opportunities, to take our kids to more activities, to make a little more money, to strive just a little bit harder for that big break that will finally make us happy and set us free? Well, my guest today has come to the conviction that this pursuit after limitless freedom is just killing us. She thinks that not only are our human limits part of God's good creation, but they are where we find our true freedom and enjoy space to glorify our Creator. Ashley Hales is a writer, speaker, and host of the Finding Holy podcast. She holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh and is the author of A Spacious Life, trading hustle and hurry for the goodness of limits. Ashley Hales, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks so much for having me.
I wanted this book to introduce my listeners to a concept that seems very counterintuitive, but which I've become increasingly convinced is crucial in recent weeks. And that is that creaturely limits are where we find true happiness and strength and success and love. So we're going to be focusing for a couple of weeks on this topic. But I think that A Spacious Life, as we were saying before we hit record here, is an outstanding introduction to that question and the really practical dimensions of it. So I want to open with this question. What's the deal with our culture and limits? Why are we so afraid of them? Why are we at war with them? And what inspired you to, kind of say, we need to change our thinking on this?
I think you get so many things in advertising and media, and even the way that we have an amalgamation of social media influencers on our feeds kind of shows us that we're supposed to do it all. We're supposed to dress our children in sepia tones on Instagram and make everything homemade while also holding down a high-powered job and volunteering in our churches. And then, of course, we still have time for date nights and, alone time. We've kind of created this amalgam of the be it all, have it all, do it all. And that has become what we think of as freedom in America, particularly, that if we have the opportunity, of course, then we should take every opportunity.
There's a song by one of my favorite musical groups, the Arcadian Wild, and it's called The Anthem of Mr. Dark. The main line in the chorus is that we need to learn to say no, that our saying yes to everything constantly is actually just driving us down into a pit of endless work and busyness and harried, restless feeling, and that saying no is actually really empowering. What's the source of that in our culture? Is it an American thing? Is this something that everybody struggles with? What's been your experience on that?
I think it happened in a lot of Western cultures. Way back several decades ago, Leslie Newbegin, who had his missionary work in India and came back to the UK, and he talks about this idea of the pursuit of happiness. And unfortunately, we've really defined happiness only about what each autonomous individual might give it. So however we define it means that therefore is the definition of happiness. And so I think it's just built into, right, to a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so if we define happiness as whatever I want to do, my own autonomous freedom, then we also have not only the pressure to live up to that and to constantly creating that, but that also these kind of goalposts of achievement that we culturally are ascribing to continually move back. Even if we actually get the thing or the promotion, there's always another ladder rung to climb.
What are those goalposts of achievement you're thinking of?
Well, I think we see it in workplaces and corporate workplaces a lot, either if it's a promotion or salary figure. In parenting, we see it, that, however our kids, quote unquote, turn out, is a reflection on our own worth as individual parents. We see it in the church. Metrics of success look like lots more people or a building or, a certain kind of program having a certain quote unquote success rate. And so we see it in lots of different ways in which we're looking for validation for our worth and our dignity outside of ourselves based on something that we can create, instead of saying, actually, our limits are good. God created the world with limits. And so we actually will find our greatest happiness as we live within those good God-given limits.
You said that limits are good. Now, I think we need to pause and dig into this for a second, because we often have this unspoken assumption that being human, I'm all too human. I'm a limited, finite human, that we need to apologize to each other and to God for that. Like, if only we could be like God and be limitless and be able to do everything and know everything and be everywhere and serve every need, then we would be good. But since we're human, we're not good. Where's the mistake in that thinking?
Yeah. I think you really hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways, because that was, right, the lie of the garden, right? That we could, if we took the fruit, right, that we could have this limitlessness that only God has. And what's so beautiful about, I think, when we think about creation, that creation was actually, before the fall, given limits, right? Planets had orbits. The cycle of the seasons meant that, the earth was not bringing forth vegetation every other second. That there are natural limits to people, right? You have to live in one particular place. You can't be everywhere at once. You're limited in a covenantal relationship, Adam and Eve as husband and wife, and limited in, in their gifts and talents and strengths, regardless of what sin has done to twist that. So I think there's a sense in which we have to hold on to those good creational limits, and Jesus shows us how best to do that. But then we also have to recognize that because of sin, there are limits, the ways that we don't love one another, the ways that we exploit each other, we exploit the earth. Perhaps I should make that a little more clear. Yeah, I think creational limits are good. God created the world with limits. And so limits full stop are not bad, but there's a way in which we have tended to just think any sort of limit on me is a bad thing.
Yes. There's this kind of resignation and slumping of our shoulders and saying, well, yeah, I'm only human. I have these limits. I can't do more than a certain amount. And whether it's sinful or just what I am, that's a bad thing, or that's an undesirable thing. So even if we don't make the mistake of attributing our temporal natures and our embodied natures and so forth to the fall, we can still think it's somehow a bad thing. But you hit the gate running in this book with this assumption that it's not actually a bad thing. In fact, it could be empowering and powerful and create opportunities that would never have existed otherwise. Could you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah. I think I just tell a quick story in the book about one of my friends. She's a writer, Lori Wilbert, and she remembers, she was telling me how in her undergraduate work, in her art class, for a whole semester, one of her professors said that you can only pick 2 complementary colors. 2 colors. That's like all you could work with the entire semester. And they hated it, right, at first. But that limit, right, on the actual art actually made it way more interesting, way more creative, because within that guardrail of that limit, it actually allowed for a lot more creativity to flourish. Instead of simply kind of taking the easy way out, they had to come up with some new ideas. And so I think that's really encouraging too, to think about our limits aren't like, wah, we're stuck in this teeny little box. And, if it looks like living in my limits is going to actually be stifling, and that's what we imagine, but it actually can be the place of a lot of growth, whether that's spiritually or creatively or professionally as well.
I'm plagiarizing from someone here. I can't remember exactly who it was, so I apologize. But somebody, or maybe several somebodies in my reading and listening and watching, pointed out that limits actually for human beings function like a kind of leverage where it actually gives us much greater power than if we were sort of creatures that for whom anything was meaningful. So here are some examples. When you go to play the piano, and if you just put a little kid in front of it and don't give them any lessons, they're just going to bang on it and make a bunch of noise. And that's actually not freedom, even though, they can hit any key in any order, right? That's maximum freedom. Well, it turns out that to play a piece from Beethoven or something, that's the ultimate freedom on the piano, is to play something that a master has done, or to compose your own masterpiece. But guess what? That requires limits of which notes you can hit in which order, for which duration, and which time signature. There's order that corresponds with the limit. Another example would be like chess. So if you can move any piece in any direction at any time, turns out you don't have chess. You've just destroyed chess, because the limits are chess. That's the definition of it. So you find power and empowerment in this sort of restriction or these guardrails. I don't think we think about that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or, just a very pedestrian example of, to get from point A to B in your car, you need to follow the speed limit and lane lines, right? And the laws of the road. Otherwise, all chaos is going to break loose. And so it actually, by staying within your lane, you can actually get to where you need to go quickly and efficiently, properly.
I like this analogy that you use early on in the book about walking into a supermarket. And this is after you came home from Scotland, I think it was. And you came back to an American supermarket and you looked at the mayonnaise aisle, right? And were just overwhelmed by the choice there. It didn't make you happy. Could you, this is something I've talked about with my colleagues a lot. Could you talk about that infinite choice problem?
Right. I think, there's a sense in which if we have, whatever the analog is, if it's, your vegan mayo and your full fat mayo and your fat free mayo and your olive oil mayo, and, in each brand, right, at some point you just get choice paralysis, right? You're not able to make choices. And we figure out some shortcuts and just like, okay, I always buy this brand and this thing. And that's, so we don't have to make that choice from the ground up every time. But, if you think about it, if every option is open to us, whether that's where we live or if that's in our work lives or in our family and friendships, if every option is always open to us, we're never going to be able to act well and deeply. We're never going to be able to sustain the boring bits of those things. And so those limits that we have around our relationships and our work lives actually help us to flourish and to dig deeper.
Could you kind of give us an overview of what our limits are? Because I think we've touched on a few of them, but what does it mean to be a human being? How do we contrast with God, again, in ways that are not due to our sin, but are just literally part of what we are?
Right. Well, we're obviously bound by time, whereas God is not. And so we have temporal limits. We also have limits in that we are created creatures within a created system, within a created universe. And so we, our bodies work appropriately according to limits. Like we won't survive on Mars. We will only survive on Earth. Yeah. The way that God created our bodies, we have to sleep. We have to be able to have times of rest and work. We have to actually learn how to be present in our particular places and not feeling ourselves to be everywhere at once, whether that's in kind of our haste and our rush, or if it's in kind of our digital expanse and placelessness. And so, I think as we think about the limits that Jesus shows us, we can see he also had limits of vocation and calling, right? He didn't heal everybody. So I think, there's a sense in which staying in our lane, if we're going to keep coming back to that metaphor, staying within God's good guardrails, whether it's season of life, whether it's kind of our calling vocation, whether it's our family situation, our friendships, that they all create spaces for us to glorify God and to enjoy him and to make him known. And the challenge, right, is to begin to name those limits that are particular to us and to our communities, and to figure out how do we live within them well.
You focus a lot in the book on Jesus' own experience, his own story, his own incarnation, and what it tells us about our limits. Because it turns out, aside from being, our Lord and Savior, Jesus affords us a great opportunity to look at what unfallen humanity looks like, or we should say glorified humanity, so fully in tune with God's design, fully embracing limits and living righteously within that. So could you, when I say Jesus is limited, or you even use language stronger than that Jesus became finite in a, you can put the theological qualifiers on that it has to do with his human nature, not his divine nature. But what does that mean? And why is it such a huge deal that God assumed limits?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's just mind-boggling, and obviously we can't fully comprehend it. But yeah, to think the second person of the Trinity chose to leave the glory of heaven to be with us. A lot of times we think about that in terms of God's immanence and his nearness to us, that Jesus became flesh and he kind of tabernacled amongst us. And all of that is true. But I think it's also helpful to think, he willingly took on limits, took on flesh, a particular body in a particular place amongst a particular people at a particular time. He walked, to get everywhere. And, so many things like that. And, ordered his days according, to scripture and prayer and silence. And you see that kind of developing in Jesus and what we would call today kind of a non-anxious presence. He's never rushing. He's totally interruptible all of his ministerial years. And part of that has got to be that he learned how to live within his limits without transgressing them in the way that we do to either try to make a name for ourselves or kind of prop up our own reputation or sense of worth apart from what God says we are.
And he had a context too, which is so interesting. In announcing his coming to Mary, the angel Gabriel is kind of limiting God's unique presence in that unique one-time way of being a baby in a womb to one person, in being born to Mary and Joseph and raised in a particular town with going to a particular synagogue and knowing particular friends and so forth. That's a limit. He's saying no to the whole rest of the world in order to be a local Jewish boy in Nazareth. I want to get your thoughts on this, because there have been a spate of books that have come out lately that I've really enjoyed. A couple of them by Carl Trueman. So there's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then his digest of that. And then Trevin Wax wrote a book called Rethink Yourself, which was thematically very similar to Trueman's book. But they all had to do with this idea of the selfhood of modern people, that we have this idea of the self and what it is and what it means in terms of the good life that is very unhistorical. It's something that developed through a discernible genealogy of thought, going back to guys like Rousseau, who thought meaning comes from within. It's not imposed or given from without. What would you say we can learn from the story of Jesus and from the kind of challenge of this book in light of that cultural assumption that we make ourselves instead of being made in some way by others?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really thoughtful question. I think we have to first name that narrative, right? Like some of those books are doing, to say this idea that we can create ourselves and we're required to kind of curate ourselves in some way is incredibly burdensome and exhausting. I think it's Jamie Smith talks a bit about, no, it was David Brooks. He talked about how, that even young people especially are kind of being forced into this world where the only future that they can look to or have in any way is one that they have to create, right? And that's what it looks, maybe some of the application to some of those books that you've mentioned about where this idea historically and philosophically has come from. But, if we think about that as our cultural context, and then we think of, Jesus being born into a particular cultural context. I mean, part of it, right, is he grew up in a more collective society than our hyper-individualized one.
What do you mean by collective? Could you give us a definition?
Yeah, I would say, that the individual self is not the locus around which the world turns, right? It is the sense in which you belong to this group. And so that is really where, your honor and shame kind of come from is that group identity versus, the individual who needs to go out and create that for themselves. And so I think, where limits might come into that, as we think through our own very hyper individualized cultural context, is to first begin to name that's a limit that we are being born into, right? That we are born into a very hyper individualized cultural context. And so how do we live faithfully? And it might look like embracing these very basic limits, like getting sleep, choosing to not do as much as you think you could or should, and to practice, the disciplines of prayer and fasting and Sabbath. And, that these might be some of the ways back into remembering our limits and to practicing them instead of kind of easily acquiescing to this, you can be limitless knowledge that's kind of the water that we swim in.
Right. I think one of the strengths of this book is precisely in your refusal to try to transcend your own limits and your own history and your own context. So you are a wife and mother, as well as an academic and an author. So you're speaking from your own experience. And because of that, you are speaking in a way that's going to be very relevant and easily grasped by fellow mothers who are trying to juggle a lot of things. But I think that one of the ways that this book also touches the experience of, say, a 34-year-old father like myself would be this social media issue. So chapter 3 is called Jesus Isn't on Instagram, an invitation to set aside social media. Now, we're no stranger to the sort of damage that social media is doing and the calls that many have made to be conscious of that damage and limit ourselves. Like I've got a copy of Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, which is, what is it, like 13 years old at this point on my desk here. But talk to us about this call that you make on social media and why specifically is social media a problem when it comes to trying to, acknowledge and celebrate our limits?
I think part of it is in what the idea that the internet generally and media particularly encourages us to think of ourselves, that we are centered. And when you can flit back and forth between various social media platforms, we have the sense that we can be everywhere, right? We can be having conversations with people from all over the world. We can be reading news from all over the world. We can have opinions about them and put them up online. All of that can be fabulous and super exciting to have friends from, various places and cultural contexts. But really what it does is it promises us that we can both get out of our bodies, out of our places, out of the problems of our families or whatever it is. And we can easily use social media then as well to try to get out of the limits of our bodies, of our angst, of the fact that maybe a child had a meltdown or we're in a fight with our spouse or like we're just procrastinating on a work deadline. And so we turn to social media because it gives us this hit of we can be everywhere and we can control the narrative. And so it kind of gives us those same kind of lies from the garden about you can be like God here. So I think it's important that we both see what the false promises are of social media and why we each individually go to it to try to get away from some of the pain of being limited.
So here's another Florida story that absolutely no one else and my listeners will be able to relate to, but it's, like the whales. So my favorite hobby is scuba diving. Everyone who listens to the podcast knows that's what I like to do. And I find these giant fossilized shark teeth. So in the Gulf of Mexico, we've got a lot of cool fossil deposits. So they're the megalodon. If you ever heard of the megalodon, that's what they are. But, when I was a kid, I would find a very small kind of beat up, broken tooth. And I'd be like, this is the greatest thing of all time. And I would put it at the centerpiece of my collection and I would just look at it every day and stuff. Now I'll find these just incredible teeth. But as soon as I go on Instagram or Facebook or one of the other places where the other fossil divers are posting their stuff, somebody's got a better, bigger, shinier, more pristine museum quality thing they've found. And all of a sudden, what I found doesn't look so great anymore. And this is the old comparison is the thief of joy. problem, but it's on steroids, because one of the limits that we used to have, and this goes for houses and, kids and vacations and cars and absolutely anything else in your life, dinners we cook, that sort of thing. I know that my wife looks at things other mothers have put together and just is immediately troubled by that. We didn't used to know about that stuff. Now we do know about that stuff thanks to this faux omniscience we have in our pockets, and it's making us unhappy. Why on earth do we still engage in that? I mean, what is the draw?
I think, there's the fear of missing out. There's the dopamine hit. There's the sense of, if I don't show up here, I'm going to be unseen and irrelevant. I think it takes so much courage to live a quiet, limited life. Yeah,
that's true. What did you say about, there was someone in the park, like a story of someone in the park who was unaware of all the conflict and important headlines and important opinions that needed to be given about something, who was just like sitting by a pond and looking at the ducks or something and being present. It gives me the image of the whale on the beach, and we're just here trying to be God, trying to be omniscient and have an opinion about everything or respond to everything. And there's someone actually being human, living within their limits, and that person's happy. Let's ask about the opinion thing real quickly, because so Twitter is the context where we usually see this. And a friend of mine named Samuel James has written a good bit about the way social media persuades / compels us to have an opinion about everything. What is the good that we're giving up by feeling that pressure to respond or have a take or have an opinion on every news story, or when something bad happens in the news? Say there's an act of apparent police brutality, the pressure to go on there and say something. What's the problem with that, and what are we losing when we succumb to that pressure?
I think we are losing the long, slow work of wisdom for sure. Because often, wisdom comes through suffering and perseverance and humility and a lot of pain often. And to grow up into a more wise individual, we can't simply be reacting. And social media and all of those sorts of event-based things encourage immediate reaction and not a longer, slower, maybe darker even kind of journey towards wisdom. So I think that's firstly what I would say. We're giving up, we're short-circuiting the path to wisdom through the need to always comment. And secondly, I think the idea too is that if we post it on social media, like what if it's kind of an activism thing, that we've therefore actually done something. And so it actually fools us into believing we're invested because we've performed our outrage. Instead of, what does it look like then to volunteer at a local prison? What would that look like? What would it look like to actually read some book length treatments on issues of violence or whatever, whatever it is. And so it gives us the idea that okay, great. I'm on the right side of history, whatever that is, by performing my outrage. And therefore we're not actually really doing anything. Yes.
The process of wisdom is one of those many processes that our limits impose on us. But that is just the only human way to come to wisdom. It's why the Bible constantly talks about the gray head being a representation of wisdom. This is someone who ideally has gone through the processes necessary to become wise and come out the other side with that long, slow, fermented realization of how the world really is. And that person can point to a younger person like the father in Proverbs and say, listen, my son, this is how things are. I've arrived at the conclusion through a long and slow process. You have in the 4th chapter, it's called Of Cucumbers and Skipping Stones. And you invite readers to wait. This to me, it's a chapter about process and the way that time limits us, but also in that limit, we find great wisdom and empowerment. Talk to us about the limit of time and why it's important to learn to wait.
It reminds us that we're not in control. And I think a lot of our, microwavable instantaneous sort of life that we lead. We don't even have to like go to an encyclopedia, right? We can be like, hey, Siri, just tell me the answer to this question. There's so many things that are on kind of instant replay in the ways in which we think and live. And so the importance of waiting really brings up the idea of control and our lack of control. And so we can really it's a nice little assessment of our soul and our maturity to begin to say, in what way have I tried to live outside of the bounds of time? In what way, either through my use of the internet or through not sleeping or through neglecting practices like Sabbath, that we have tried to live in this mechanized world where everything kind of comes out of a factory looking exactly the same at exactly the same rate. And so, and it also just asks us, when we have to live within the limits of time, to acquiesce to a future that we can't control or know, and to yet then, as Christians, press into the fact that God knows and cares and is present through His Spirit. So I think, it's really tricky. It's really hard. And I think to even then say, for instance, I'm sick and I'm not feeling well. And so what are the limits on my time today, let's say, in those reduced circumstances? Can I actually treat myself gently? Can I extend grace to other people? Can I ask for help? It helps create a stronger community that way too, I think.
And your realization of your own limits, of course, creates compassion for others in a way that nothing else can. So, you've been sick, you immediately know what it's like, and you have great compassion on someone else. And then out of that emerges this opportunity for love. That's something we need to come back to before we're done here, is to talk about the ways that sin has created new limits, but that those limits themselves can be and are turned back toward goodness by Christ first, and then by His people. But tell us what the cucumber is all about first. Teach us of the parable of the cucumber.
So this was, one of these things. It was during the pandemic. My husband had built a beautiful planter bed, and my daughter we all picked different things to grow in our little planter bed. And she was maybe 4 or so at the time. And she was so excited to watch these cucumbers grow. She was excited to wait for them, and so she would tend to these cucumbers and overwater them. And even when things weren't going well and there was, a hole in the leaf, that she would be so expectant, right, that these cucumbers were coming. And so that waiting became part of the gift of the cucumbers too, to see how it would emerge. And I think most of the time, right, we just, pick up our cucumbers at the grocery store. And so we don't see waiting as a gift. But yes, my little daughter, Harriet, reminded me that part of that process, part of that waiting, either if we're waiting just in a difficult season of our lives, isn't to like get from point A to B, and to realize actually there's something that happens to us as we go through, as we wait. And so how do we move through those waiting times with God? And that's, it's an invitation to hold on for sure in the midst of those waiting times.
One of the other issues that you tackle here goes back to something that John Piper said years ago, and I didn't really fully grasp it when he said it, but he wrote something to the effect of, sometimes the most spiritual act you can undertake is to get a good night's sleep, to put down whatever you're doing and just get a good night's sleep. And at that point, my theology of embodiment and what it means to be a rational animal, that, in the Thomas Aquinas's terms, of to be a human, wasn't fully there yet. So I didn't really get what he means. Now I get what he meant. But you talk about rest itself as not just a good night's sleep, but all kinds of rest as something that is a crucial limit on our lives, but that can actually create the context for the greatest empowerment, fulfillment, and beauty. Could you give us an overview of rest and what you do in the chapter about the instant pot?
Yeah, I think Although I have friends who have the Instant Pot, so I might have to rethink if I'm going to ever get that appliance. But it does change, right, how we think about things, right? That that there's this idea that we can short circuit our sense of time, or from like point A to point B to get this great meal. It's going to happen instantly. And I think what's so beautiful about this invitation to rest is to say that there's something that happens to us in our relationship to God when we choose rest and when we prioritize rest, and not as like I'm working for the rest for the weekend, but that actually in creation, that rest is the first word, grace is the first word. And so God gives us a Sabbath that then is because we are loved children of God, and even just all people made in God's image are to have a rest, right? That we start from rest. We don't try to earn our rest. And so often we can feel like rest is something we have to earn. So we only get it if we've worked hard. And so whether it's kind of a Sabbath rest, or if it's just even getting a good night's sleep, and we see this with Jesus. I love the story of him and the calming of the seas. And we talk a lot about, gosh, he is Lord of heaven and earth. He's calmed the seas and the storms. But also he was sleeping. And, there's something beautiful about that the circumstances of that reality were, of course, immense. But how do you sleep well, right? When we're racked with anxiety, we don't sleep well, right? We wake up and like your brain is spinning. It won't stop. But if we are so secure in our identity as God's children, like Jesus was, we can actually sleep. And so there is a sense in which practicing sleep is a very first and practical spiritual discipline to say, I'm limited, I'm not in control, my worry is not going to fix anything. And so I delight to receive this as a gift from my good Father, whether that's sleeping or Sabbath or putting down our phones or whatever it is. It reminds us that we're not in charge.
There's such a beautiful paradox too in Jesus' slumber in the boat there. I mean, he's worn out from all the preaching and all the miracles that he's been performing, and he obviously is not worried about a thing. He's just chilled out. I mean, having been on a boat on some fairly rough seas, I can tell you, I don't know how you can actually sleep. I had a friend one time, and he was in the bow down below, and he came back out at a certain point and said, I can't do that. I'm in the air half the time. I'm just like flying around, smashing into the walls or whatever. You can only imagine Jesus is probably rolling around and smashing into stuff. But the disciples say, "Hey, wake up! We're dying here. We're actually about to drown." And he says, "Oh, you have little faith." And then he goes and calms the storm. But it's like the limit there is so interesting because he is living within his human limits. He who has the power to calm the wind and the waves is laying down and getting some shut-eye. I think to me, there is an apparent contradiction between the God who can do that and the man who needs a nap. But Jesus is this living testimony that there is no contradiction between those two, that they can actually coexist and be part of the experience of the same person who has two natures, and that this person therefore speaks to and glorifies our experience. I mean, that's just so cool and profound to me. And I'm glad you pointed that out in the book. Right.
Yeah. He needs a nap. So do we.
Yeah. So let's move on to delight. You talk about how delight itself depends on limits. Why does delight and celebration and the kind of experience you describe, on the beach with the sunset and the kite, the guy was he from Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who is flying the kite, and your kids notice this. Why do moments like that require us to acknowledge our limits?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we think we want to orchestrate everything to elicit delight or beauty, or it's kind of like if you arrived at someone's house and they're a very fussy host or hostess and, they're organizing everything just so, and you don't actually get to delight, right, when it becomes so overwrought. And so there is a sense in which to actually experience delight, we have to kind of back our foot off the gas and to experience being present in a particular place in a particular moment. And I think especially for those of us who are adults and find like we've left this idea of play behind us a long time ago, that, delight can be a way back in to remembering who we really are and to exulting in our limits. And that, like at that moment, I had all these great ideas for what I wanted our picnic by, on the bluffs of the ocean to be. And yet my kids had another idea, and they met and we heard someone else's story from halfway across the world. And none of that would have happened had I just said, this must happen and I will do everything I can to make my plan happen. So it involves a kind of suppleness and an open-handedness with our time and our attention.
I like that a lot. And I'm glad you mentioned also the sort of affluent Western and especially American impulse to say, I'm going to work really, really hard, get all the, finances in order, have the resources I need, and then I'm going to take my family on a vacation to Hawaii or something like that. And that'll be the reward and the relaxation that we need. And so not only do we sort of set unrealistic expectations for that week or however long it is and kill ourselves in the meantime, but we do the very thing that you cannot do if you want to have true delight and enjoyment and a time of rest. And that is to plan it all out. You can't plan it all out. It's saying, we're going to have this little block of quality time. Never works. I mean, you probably know this as a parent as well. Some of the most precious moments, like the one you wrote about on the beach, happen precisely in the unscripted times when we haven't said, this is how things are going to go. And we've just allotted a large amount of time to just be with the people we love. It's amazing how difficult it is for Western people to let go of that impulse to plan, to prepare and plan and prepare and plan.
Mm-hmm. And I think you do a good job to remind us of that margin. And you think of the margin around a piece of notebook paper, and that, for the good thing to happen that's inside on that paper, right? You do need that margin to be able to read the essay or whatever it is. And we have to have that built-in margin to be able to, I think, play and delight in each other and in the created order. And also just like, God might be up to something new and we're just hurrying by and we're not paying attention to what he actually wants from us or who he wants us to speak to when we are so scheduled to the hilt.
How much cultural reformation do you think we as Americans actually have to have on this? Because I had an art teacher who spent a lot of time as a missionary in Uganda, and she would jokingly talk to us about, she fondly remembered this thing she called Africa time. So what it means is that if you schedule a meetup with somebody at a certain place at 3:00, what that means is that they will show up sometime after 3:00, non-specifically, but it's, no one's in a hurry. And part of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the roads are in terrible shape and you might break down and there might be a massive herd of goats that wants to cross in front of you or whatever. But a lot of it is also a cultural commitment to, or just something that happens in that culture, which is that no one's in the same rush they are in our culture. And obviously it gets tricky when you're trying to say this culture is better than that culture or this practice is better than that practice. But I know that Africa time is parallel to a lot of cultures around the world that place much less emphasis on being precisely on time than Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, English-speaking cultures do. Where do you think is there a need for cultural reformation there, or can we just kind of live within our culture and apologize for being late, or how do we do that without being rude to people? I'm really curious for your take on that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think a lot of it maybe could be in our posture, or our attitude, or the way that we receive late people. Even thinking about the ways in which you could model something like what you're saying, that Africa time. The sense of like, the point is to be together, right? The point is not, did you come bearing gifts with, your bottle of wine and flowers, to kind of like make up for the hospitable invite? I think there is this sense in which to live counterculturally, you still have to live within, the actual, you can't like show up to work at 10 a.m. instead of 8. You'd be like, I
was really hoping you would encourage me to do that. And no,
I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, there's a sense in which, right, we must live well in the land that we're in. And yet, in what ways can we practice some of those countercultural slower rhythms that would, even just the way that we pay attention to people, right? And not pulling out our phones or, I think there's probably little small ways that we can push back some of those kind of mechanized sense of value and worth.
That's good. You write that love isn't a cocktail party. And a lot of these chapters have sort of fun titles that are evocative of a story you tell, but you could never tell without reading it what the story is about. Tell us that story about what do you mean by cocktail parties and how does it relate to this idea of love and of really paying attention to other people?
Yeah. I think when you think of a cocktail party, at least, on all of the TV dramas or whatever, everyone's dressed up and everything's real fancy and everyone's kind of trotting out their resumes vocally with one another. It's this kind of, well, let me tell you about, my vacation to Hawaii that I just took and my new corner office. And, there's a sense in which it's always centering the self. And we're all it's like toddlers and, they do the parallel play and they're not actually interacting with one another. They just are playing next to one another. And I think cocktail parties are kind of created to do that. And, and part of that's fun and, witty, but there's a sense in which, I've realized, and it's still something that I struggle with immensely. I'll just like burst into my family room and be like, this is the article I just read. And, other people are doing other things or my husband's in the middle of reading something and I've not paid attention to the actual people in front of me. It's more of like, hey, I want to just share. That's not really what love looks like, right? Love is attentive and it's individual and it's limited by that person that you are trying to love. It's incredibly specific. And so even if to me, like expressing myself might feel really good, it's not a way to love other people. And so when we think about the limits of our time, the limits of our attention, it means then we choose to limit ourselves for the sake of love. Love always requires limits.
I think it was Brian Regan in a comedy routine years ago, years ago. And he talked about the astronaut at the cocktail party and how, it does, you get somebody up there who's doing the whole routine you just talked about where he's like, oh yeah, I run a global multinational corporation and made this many millions of dollars last year. And he's like, I wish I could be an astronaut. Cause then you always have the trump card at a cocktail party. Cause you can be like, I walked on the moon.
Right,
and then everyone's like, okay, Mr. Astronaut, we moonwalker, we defer to your greater experience. But you can see exactly what you're talking about there. It's just not loving. You're not interested in what the other people have to think or say or contribute. You just want to say your thing and be the center of attention. Well, tell us where the limit is there, because I think it may be implicit, but it's important for us to understand why that limit exists and why we must embrace it.
When, if we just think particularly about, Jesus often would be headed somewhere for one purpose and be interrupted and would heal a person. And he never shamed any of those people in their interruptions, even if he had very strong words to say, to Pharisees, for instance. But, there's a sense in which, we believe that in order to love someone, often it looks like either indulging their desire, right? Or, and negating our own or vice versa. And it's kind of like a win-lose situation is often, I think, how we practically think about what does it look like to love. If they get what they want, that means I must not get what I want. But the sense of hurry and love, they can't be together. John Comer talks about them just as incompatible. Hurry and love are incompatible. And so I think there's a sense in which we have to limit our agenda. We have to limit our hurry and our haste to actually love the people that are really in front of us well. And so that might also mean we limit some wider relations so that we can actually love the real people in front of us first before we move on to those vague, internet people that we might be like, but they're so interesting and fascinating. But so we have to actually limit some of our relational capacity so that we can love people who are right in front of us in our neighborhoods and our churches and our workplaces and our families.
I think my favorite metaphor in the book is the salt in the chapter about community. And the reason is because it illustrates to me the way that limits are actually not a choice. We don't choose to be limited in a certain way. We choose whether to embrace the limit and enjoy the results of that, or to fight the limit and actually rob ourselves of precious blessings. And the analogy of the community coming together and being that gathered together salt, rather than just one crystal that essentially has no effect on the world. The salt can come together and season the metaphorical food, the whole culture that it creates. It can preserve. To be salty, which is, salt and light is the biblical image, means to gather together in community. And if you refuse to do that because you're afraid of particularizing, or you're afraid of being stuck in a particular town, or having to, as C.S. Lewis says, worship beside someone with the creaky boots or the singing off key, then you're actually going to miss the blessing. There is no other way to get it. Talk to us about community and salt and particularity, especially within the church.
It's just so many of the metaphors that Jesus uses are so apt today still. And, it's just amazing, right? When you think about okay, so if the church is to be salt and light, it means that they work together. Paul talks about that we're members of one body. And there's a sense in which we don't function unless we are gathered together, that something happens in community, in the church, that can't happen with any of us individually. There's the way that salt works, right, on a dish or something is going to dramatically affect the taste of the whole thing. And so there's a sense in which we need salt to function well. And yet when you taste like the sea salt on a bit of dark chocolate, you're like, oh, the chocolate tastes really good, right? Salt never calls so much attention to itself. If it does, there's way too much salt. But there's a sense in which salt makes things taste how they should, right? It makes things taste better. It makes things more beautiful. It preserves things. And so if we think of the church like that, it's to remember that as much as we often will tell ourselves and get annoyed, with the cookie boot wearer or whatever the analog is today, that we actually don't get our own rough edges smoothed, unless we're consenting to the constraints of community, and to realize that we are not so arrogant, or should not be so arrogant, to believe that we can live without the community.
I have come to believe, Ashley, that one of the reasons modern people, especially in America, refuse to live within our limits, and we refuse to commit to particularity, whether that's in marriage or a church or a career or an education trajectory or whatever it is, a neighborhood, is because we're deeply committed to preserving our potential. We love the idea of limitless potential, that we could be anything, do anything, go anywhere, work any job, or find the ideal situation. And I think this idealism comes into play, especially in the area of the church. Christians have a very hard time because we've absorbed this set of values from our culture, committing to a body of believers, to a local congregation. And we know the stats on this. We know that, church attendance is very bad right now. The effort to draw Christians back in after the pandemic has only succeeded to a limited degree. People just haven't come back the way that we would hope they should. And part of that, I understand, because there is no perfect church. You're not going to find the congregation where they have exactly the worship style that you would like, and the sermons are exactly the passages you would like, and make exactly the points you would like, and that ticks all the theological boxes, and it just happens to have an excellent singles ministry or marrieds ministry or women's ministry or whatever it is. It's a huge order. It's a massively tall order. How do we learn to embrace that imperfect particularity? And then what happens to us if we don't?
Well, I'll answer that second bit first. What happens if we don't? If we're always looking for the next church or the next spouse or, whatever, to kind of meet, hopefully not, but I've seen that happen in the lives of people we know. So, there's a sense in which there's something deeply wrong and flawed with this local congregation. Yes, there is, because we are a group of sinners. But to consistently then choose to uproot ourselves from that local accountability, that local change, we're always treating the church as another consumer product. So if I don't like this brand, I can go over to that brand. And then when that one doesn't work, I'll switch again. And so we never actually grow through challenge or difficulty. We never are stuck with boring sermons or, whatever it is, and actually say, okay, well, how am I still being ministered to, but also how am I ministering to others, and how am I bearing with this group of folks? How do we get there? I'm increasingly convinced that, as Jesus was praying for his people, he prayed for unity, and he prayed for the church to abide in him in the same joy that he abides in the Father. And of course, we don't really understand all of that, but there's a sense in which, as we stay put, in our actual places and our actual congregations, that kind of the fruit of the Spirit actually grows in us as individuals. I think we become less anxious. We become much more wise. We become, in a way that the fruit won't grow if we're kind of the tree that's always uprooting ourselves. But there's a sense in which, too, Jesus's bride is the church. And so we cannot just say that she's not good enough for us.
And if we refuse to do that, if I could add something here, and this is an insight, I think it was Jordan Peterson who pointed this out. He said that part of the reason we love babies is because they're full of limitless potential. They're just beautiful and they're bursting potential, but babies don't retain their apparently infinite potential. They grow. And that's happening to us. We're along the same continuum. We're growing into something at the exact same rate as everyone else, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're becoming and losing that potential. And it's becoming actuality, which means to me that in every area of life, we have a choice. We can either become in our refusal to embrace something. So we just become a nobody. We become a lonely person who is not committed to any other people, who is not living in a community, who's not chosen a job, who's not chosen a church. That's what we actually become. We can't stop and say, I'm not going to make a choice yet. So the choice before us is really, do we do that? Or do we actually pick an imperfect spouse, an imperfect church, an imperfect neighborhood, an imperfect job, and become something worthwhile in that context? That was really eye-opening, because I think a lot of, my generation in particular, are holding on to that potential. They think they can hold on to limitless potential because there's always something better out there, whether it's a job or a spouse or a church or what have you. But even if there is something better out there, one of your limits is you don't have the time to sit there and infinitely pursue the better option. You actually do have to pick something at some point if you want to become anything. And that's because of I know we're coming up against the end of our time here, but I think the conclusion of the book is really worth saying a word about, because you go through death and resurrection in the conclusion. And death, of course, is a limit that is imposed on us by our fallenness. That's something that sin did. But at the beginning, we talked about how those sin-induced limits can be turned into something beautiful. Could you kind of describe for us where you land the book and the role that death and resurrection play, and how Jesus helps us to overcome those fallen limits in a way that is profoundly beautiful?
Yeah, I think what is beautiful is, even the limits that we don't choose, or even the limits that sin or our general fallenness have hoisted upon us individually and communally and institutionally, that Jesus chooses to limit himself for love, that he takes on, the constraints of sin even for us, and then that he is raised again to new life, just shows us that even all of our limits and the ways that we mess up limits and the ways that we choose hurry and we choose status and opportunity, often so much more than just being human, shows us that even when we do all of those things, right, that redemption is always the last word, that resurrection is always the last word, that even when we have chosen to abide through pain, through suffering, and we stay close to the heart of God, it doesn't mean, of course, that everything is going to go away, but that somehow all, as Tolkien talks about, that everything sad will come untrue. And that is the surprising, right, limitlessness of our God, that he will take our limits and transform them into something beautiful. And so it gives us a lot of hope, I think, to embrace the limits of our body, whether that's little deaths of the self or it's, the big D death at the end of our lives, to know that it's really all of our limits are directing us towards the heart of God. And as we press through those limits into knowing God, that good things, even if they feel painful at the moment, will result.
Ashley, who do you think needs this book? Who did you kind of have in mind as you wrote it?
At first I wanted to write it for like the high achiever who just needed to be told to like, girl, embrace your limits. And then I was really writing angry prose and it wasn't helpful. It really, as I thought of friends who feel that weight and that pressure of trying to be it all and do it all and feel like they're a failure at every turn, to say that even our pain and the limits that we have that are ordinary and feel hurtful, those things can be redeemed. And that it isn't so much about embracing our limits so that we are more successful or happy, but that's actually, those are the guardrails that lead us to God himself. And so whatever happens, whether you lose your job or, your children walk away from the faith, whether you find yourself spinning your wheels in a cycle of endless hurry and productivity, to know that all of that can be redeemed. And it's not just embrace your limits and you'll get your path to improvement. But to say that this is actually how God has made us to work best, to be human and to press in when those limits are painful and hard, and that he will never leave us or forsake us.
Amen. My guest today has been Ashley Hales, host of the Finding Holy podcast and author of A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits. Ashley, thanks so much for joining me today on Upstream.
You are so welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.